Hi, and welcome to our talk. My name is Jimmy Angelakos, and we're going to be discussing neurodiversity and how it affects interactions within the workplace and the IT community in general. What prompted this talk was the fact that I noticed many people were anxious, depressed, they had trouble with their employers, they had trouble interacting with their teams. And I reached out on social media to collect these stories. And one of the people that wrote back was Floor.
Absolutely. I did. I saw your call for input and experiences. And I had just given an internal talk about my ADHD diagnosis and how I've been basically coping with something that I, had all of my life, but I only found out about fairly late in life, right? And asked if we could do a talk about it together. And we talked some more and figured we should submit something to Posette.
So the talk is called How to Work with Other People. We discussed what prompted it. The other question for anyone who knows me is, what's wrong with Jimmy? Why isn't this a technical talk? But moving on, there's a very clear lack of awareness in IT circles around mental health issues. And that leads to unnecessary stress, as we mentioned. It leads to strained relationships with your colleagues, with your employees. It leads to burnout. It leads to people leaving companies and having this churn of people moving from company to company. It leads to conflict and strife within open source projects. And so if we can move back to the previous slide, please. It's really important to say that understanding how different things affect different people differently. What do we mean when we say that neurotypical, when we're talking about neurodiversity and mental health, is a bit of a misnomer, right? Everyone's brain is wired a little bit differently. And being accommodating to neurodivergent people has benefits for them, but for everyone in general, because everyone stands to benefit from having, let's say, clearer instructions or having better calendar management or the option to drown out the noise in the office, right? So this is why we reached out to peers in the PostgreSQL community to get their stories and get their feedback on this issue. So the goal here is to contribute to a wider understanding of what makes your team members tick. And after this talk, please, by all means, we invite you to give us your stories and your feedback. So I'm a systems and database architect. I've used Postgres exclusively as a database for 16 years and open source in general for more than 25 years. I've written an extension called PG-StatViz and a couple of books on Postgres called PostgreSQL Mistakes and How to Avoid Them and the PostgreSQL 16 Administration Cookbook. And I have been diagnosed late in life with autism spectrum disorder, which was a revelation in the sense that the signs were there, but until you read about them or you hear someone talking about them, you don't recognize it and you don't go to speak to a professional and find out what it means.
Yeah. And I'm happy to join Jimmy for this talk. I do open source community work at Ivan. Postgres is a large part of what we do. I used to work at Microsoft Grafana Labs, always in developer relations types of roles. I'm a serial conference and meetups organizer because I love getting together with people. And I always think that I have too much time on my hands. Hence, my ADHD diagnosis also later in life. I had heard about ADHD before. My mom is a primary teacher. I heard all about it for a really long time. But it took me watching someone else do a talk on ADHD and their discovery journey. And they said something that really stuck with me. They said that there was only 2 times for them, now and not now. And finally, sort of like everything made sense because that's exactly how I felt as well. And I figured out that that's maybe why I have trouble planning ahead and making sure I make deadlines. So before we go any further, I want to make sure that everybody knows that as a disclosure, neither Jimmy nor I are doctors. So we're speaking from experience here, and we're relaying the experience of some of the Postgres community members that they've shared with us. But by no means this is any medical advice. And also, as a trigger warning, we might use some ableist language in one of our slides, but that's just to prove a point. So I really hope that we don't offend anyone. And then also, before we move on, it is a little bit time for definitions, right? So I want to make sure that we catch those too. What is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity is a word that is used to explain the unique ways in which people's brains work. So while all of our brains develop it similarly, no two brains are exactly alike. And being neurodivergent just means having a brain that functions different from the average brain, right? So from a neurotypical person. Because it's not an external condition, you can't see that someone is not neurodiverse. It's invisible in that way. And it also makes it much harder to talk about it and to remember to consider. How prevalent is it then? Well, between 15 and 20% of people have a neurodiversity or are neurodivergent. This includes up to 10% people that have dyslexia, 5% of people that have ADHD, and 1 to 2% with autism. And despite many autistic people being very talented and qualified and willing to work, only 29% of the global population with autism are full-time employed, and oftentimes in positions that they're actually overqualified for. Then there's comorbidity. That's when one condition occurs alongside with another condition that you have been diagnosed with. And sometimes the effect is a mix that will make you being perceived by others as difficult to work with. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Then masking or camouflaging, that's when you're trying to suppress, for instance, autistic traits to appear neurotypical. And that can lead to discomfort for long periods of time while you're suppressing things that are an integral part of you. And that can lead to comorbidities like feelings of depression or anxiety. And often people that are already underrepresented in technology do a lot more masking and only find out about their diagnosis later in life.
So you may have already grasped that from our abstract, but times are hard for people in IT. There's been mass layoffs recently. There's been restructuring of companies. There are few entry-level positions. Everyone wants 10 years experience on technologies that are 5 years old. The job descriptions and interviews aren't ideal for neurodiverse people. We've had, if you remember this time, for a couple of years had to work from home, which meant that people were isolated and lost the connections they'd made at work. And then even worse, when everyone was talking about how great it was that finally companies have embraced remote work, those same companies ordered people to return to the office. And the mandatory return to office really caused some issues. And so we had the anxiety and depression of people looking for work, hopelessness and despair when the positions weren't suitable for them, which leads to feelings of inadequacy and or imposter syndrome. Maybe I'm not good enough for this position. Also, staying away from the work environment, from the office, meant that some people lost the structure that they needed to structure their day around. And then when other people were forced to return to the office after they had adjusted to working from home, then they had to deal with distractions and noise and other things that come with things such as open plan offices, let's say. So let's talk a little bit about the conditions that we're talking about. Now, depression is super prevalent. It means you have extremely low energy for most people. difficulty concentrating, sense of emptiness and despair, or being on the verge of tears almost all the time. So it's not feeling sad. Depression is something beyond that. It brings lack of motivation and pleasure in doing things, even those things that were previously very enjoyable for that person. Now, moving on to the autism spectrum, many people know that autistic people have difficulty in social interaction. Just the other day, someone said, "I'm afraid to ask you, Jimmy, because you're scary." And that is just one of the perceptions that get created, when you have poor social interaction skills. Or anyway, moving on, hyperfocus is a trait that autistic people have. And this is related to something we call monotropism, which is the inability to pull oneself away from what they're doing or what they're thinking about at that time. Generally speaking, autistic people set very high standards for themselves and then get very disappointed when they can't live up to those impossibly high standards, right? There's a constant internal pressure to do better and the tendency to take on too much work, which is then exploited sometimes by employers who just say, okay, they can manage, let's just give them more work and more work. And that, of course, as we all know, leads to burnout. There are comorbidities, there are things that are associated with autism spectrum disorder, like anxiety and depression, and there's also significant overlap with ADHD in some cases. And let's hear from Flora about ADHD.
Excellent. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and that's an executive dysfunction. So executive function helps you manage things like focus and concentration, emotional regulation, self-motivation. And so people with ADHD struggle with all of those functions to degrees varying, of course, on the individual. There are several subtypes. There is inattentive, hyperactive, and impulsive, or there is the mix. But you might know these people as either the dreamer, you can't reach them, or the person that can't sit still on a chair. Some things that come with ADHD is, for instance, time blindness. That's a term that is used to describe the difficulty that people with ADHD have in perceiving and managing their time, and that could lead to challenges with punctuality and with planning. There's also that tendency to take on too much, but just because you don't really know all of the other things that you have already taken on and where you might get into trouble time-wise. So there is a risk of burnout there too. People with ADHD also often struggle with feelings of depression, anxiety, substance abuse because they try and self-medicate, and eating disorders as well. So let's look into a couple of situations where those kind of neurodiversities come into play even more. So say, for instance, the situation where your manager asks you to meet in an hour. Now, a neurotypical person would look at this request and think to look at their calendar, see if they have time in an hour, probably plan in that meeting and send their manager a meeting invite. A person with ADHD, however, thinks, an hour. Probably I have time because I don't really know what I'm going to do in an hour. I won't check my calendar. I won't necessarily send out a calendar invite, but only think in that hour, there's all these things that I could do. Oh, look, my inbox is full. Let me respond to this very urgent looking request. Forget about the meeting and then be prompted an hour later by my manager asking, weren't we supposed to meet? Another situation is a colleague who would ask you, do you have 5 minutes now? Or are you open to feedback? Now, where your request like that without any context, like you could have said, do you have 5 minutes to discuss or to share with me how you did that travel request for PG Day New York, because I'm looking into also going there, and I think you just did that, and you could maybe share how you've done that. Like giving that sort of like context to your request makes it a lot less open to interpretation, and so a lot less stressful this goes for neurotypical person or typical people as much as for people with neurodiversities, of course. So adding some context to your request is very, very helpful. Then another situation where a colleague might use ableist language. That is, to anyone with neurodiverse, who is neurodiverse, might feel like, I am not normal, I am a joke, I will never fit in. And that can be incredibly hurtful because this is a condition and it's not a meme.
Right. So some other mental health issues that we skipped over but are worth mentioning, and neurodiversity conditions are like dyslexia is really prevalent, obsessive compulsive disorder, we just mentioned, Tourette's syndrome. Many people that are neurodivergent have melatonin deficiencies, and that means they have erratic sleep patterns, which makes them not a morning person. So in some people's minds, lazy. And this brings us to the social stigma of acknowledging mental health issues. You will have noticed that whenever there's a news report about crime, and if mental illness is present in the perpetrator, it is always mentioned, right? So that brings to some people the fear of being singled out as crazy, and it makes them afraid to speak out on their condition and how they feel about the workplace or team they're working in, because they fear that that will affect their employment or their career prospects. Also present in a community that is close to our heart, and even the Postgres community, we have to say that words matter. So when someone contributes to the discourse, or they contribute a code patch and they get feedback like, that's stupid or that's nonsense, neurodivergent people already have enough self-worth issues and imposter syndrome, as we mentioned, and that certainly doesn't help. Maybe that person will be put off contributing from the project for life if they get treated that way. But also, if you share your condition, and this is a real story that one of the people sharing with us said, when they shared their condition with their workplace, they had heartwarming acceptance and support from their colleagues. Now, it doesn't logically make sense that everyone should have the same skills and aptitudes. Are you listening, employers? And also, it doesn't make sense that you can accommodate someone's broken limb, but you can't accommodate their anxiety and depression. So maybe you can work fewer hours for less pay is not an accommodation. Finally, when it comes to hiring people that are neurodiverse, having people that think differently in your team can literally break the danger of group thing. There are skills associated with neurodiversity, like dyslexic people are really good at seeing the bigger picture and big concepts and ideas. ADHD, people that have ADHD are quick problem solvers and they're very agile. Autistic people deliver really high quality work with attention to detail. So everyone's bringing something different to the table depending on their skills and aptitudes. But neurodivergent people usually self-select away from companies because of the job description and because people ask for things such as a bubbly data center manager or a sociable data center manager, right? Things that have nothing to do with the job description. But if someone reads that and thinks, oh, I don't tick that box, therefore I'm not suitable for that job, they won't apply. So that's something to think about. And also, sorry, if we can go back to the previous slide, not everyone thinks that the same things are desirable perks in a job, right? So it's not everyone's cup of tea to have beer in the office on Fridays or foosball, right? That it's much more important to be accommodating and understanding about people's mental differences. And this brings us to changing these attitudes in companies, which is really hard. And sometimes it feels like the HR department is not there to help. So it's better to internalize those things and try them out with your colleagues, with your team, because that will eventually make enough people aware of the issues that it will spread to the companies as well, hopefully.
Yeah, and we want to dive into a couple of those tips that were on the previous slide. One of the things that I mentioned when I did my internal talk about my ADHD is some of the sort of like coping mechanisms that I use, and a lot of people found them incredibly helpful. Again, not only neurodiverse people. So one thing that I use is buddy doubling. And buddy doubling is when you hold each other accountable by doing a thing together. So for example, my expenses are due and I absolutely hate doing my expenses. And I used to refer it even as my ADHD tax. That is the money that I lost by just every fiber in my body resisting opening up that expense program. So with buddy doubling, I find someone else who also needs to do their expenses or has another chore that they're really, really like fighting against doing. We open up a video call, we open up a chat, we do the thing, we tell each other that we've done the thing, we celebrate each other for doing the thing, and then we go about our day. And so now at Ivan, the Employee Resource Group for Neurodiversity has actually set aside time every week so that people can just dial in and do the buddy doubling together, whatever task they need to get done, and get it done, literally. Another thing that I think is incredibly helpful is writing your own README. So sometimes like talking about the thing that you have might be very difficult for people, but maybe writing about it is a lot easier. And especially when you can do that by writing your own README. So hopefully we're all familiar with READMEs because we write at least that level of documentation for our projects, right? But if you write a README for yourself, that is incredibly helpful because it's almost like an internal cheat sheet for knowing how everyone prefers to work together. And so it's important that everybody in a company does it, and it's shared in a very in a central place that is accessible to everyone. So maybe on your wiki, your Notion, your intranet, whatever you're using. It's standardized questions to literally question your preferences. And it's absolutely wild how we don't think about it before we are answering those questions. Maybe as a bonus, take time to walk through these READMEs together with your team members to add some context to these. So I put some resources on the slide where you can find some of those type of READMEs templates. Another thing that is incredibly important is is timeout or time off. So a Postgres community member shared with us because they love to be around people, but it's also very exhausting. And when stuff gets too much, when they get overwhelmed, their body reacts and they start crying. And that can be completely normal to you as an individual, but it can feel a bit embarrassing, and it's not always very comfortable for everyone around you. Making sure that you have a quiet space that you can retreat to when things are too much is incredibly helpful. So, for instance, when your work includes a lot of traveling, making sure that you book a hotel that is close to or at the venue where you need to be, so that you always have a place that you can retreat to is incredibly important. Also, taking time off. One of our community members tells us that they have taken very little time off work over the years, partly because of their perfectionist tendencies and partly because there is a stigma attached to mental health issues and taking time off because of it. And they were worried about being seen as weak or unstable or not good enough at their work. Particularly unhelpful, I have found, are unlimited vacation days, because especially neurodiverse people tend to not take those when they already feel like they're being a burden. And purely speaking for myself, if I have unlimited vacation days, I will simply lose track of how many days I've taken. I feel like I've probably taken too much already, even if I probably didn't take any near the amount that one should actually take to fully recharge. I want to mention assume good intent, because really most people mean well. Nobody wants you to fail. But as a person underrepresented in tech, again, I would like to add that make sure that you cover your bases as well. Try to find your community at work, maybe in that employee resource group, sorry for that horrible acronym, or a special interest group, and find your community there and make sure that they can support you.
Other things you can do is practice empathy for other people. So you can schedule messages or emails to be posted during working hours. My personal favorite is when someone tells me what we should do next week on a Friday evening as I'm signing off of work. That's not stressful at all. And people can also write and maintain wikis that explain to people how things in the company work so that they don't feel lost. In the workplace, in the office, you can practice low lighting and low noise environments. These are helpful to lots of people. And you should probably accommodate these things by default, so people don't have to beg you for noise-canceling headphones, right? Or you can have fidget devices laying around in the office so that people don't have to ask for them. And most importantly, you have to listen instead of immediately offering solutions, right? So when someone says, I'm dyslexic, then don't immediately recommend, oh, use a spell checker and that'll solve everything.
How come I never thought about that?
These are places you can find us online.
Yeah, I would love to chat more.
And these are resources that are really important. There's a really important book, podcast, a legendary article on HuffPost, and there's also warnings associated with online mental health care, right? So you need to make sure that you protect your privacy, you protect your sensitive data. There have been fines associated with these platforms, so make sure you use someone that's approved by your health authority, and that you are speaking to someone licensed, right? You should speak, by all means, about your condition and the way you feel to friends, to professionals. Don't keep it all inside, because otherwise you may never find out what your limitations are, what your capabilities are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're very grateful to Posette for inviting us. And we want to thank you for tolerating us during this talk. Hopefully, you can use this information, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, to improve your experience and other people's experience as well. And we do believe that the PostgreSQL community does stand to gain from opening this discussion and keeping it open. Thank you very much.